Good day and welcome to the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky webinar on preemption and health advocacy. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Rochelle Seeger. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So glad you joined us today for our Health for a Change webinar. Again, my name is Rochelle Seeger. I work here at the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky as a Community Health Research Officer. I'm honored to have worked for the Foundation for 5 years on their data initiatives and also this training series. The Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky mission is to address the unmet health needs of Kentuckians, and we do that by developing and influencing policy, improving access to care, reducing health risks and disparities, and promoting health equity. You can find the Foundation's social media. I tweet out of Kentucky Health Facts. Healthy KY Twitter is the Foundation's Twitter page. We have a Facebook page, and you can also see our different websites. As part of my work here at the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky, I'm very excited to run this training series. We call Health for a Change. We began Health for a Change in 2011. And it was really to address concerns of people just like yourselves who are working in the health and health advocacy space, and they had questions or concerns, or they wanted to learn more about different topics like grant writing or coalition building, or topics just like this one on preemption. So I'm thrilled to have a great lineup of speakers for you here today on this webinar. The archives and the schedule of Health for Change are available on the Foundation's website, healthy-ky.org. And if you go to the top of the website and see the events page, you'll see the Health for a Change lineup. All of the slide decks from these webinars are available on the website. Today's slide deck will be available very soon on that website, along with a recording of today's webinar. Please also do take the time to chat in any questions you may have via the chat function on the web. Those questions will go to all of the presenters here today, so please do chat in your questions. We'll have time at the end of the hour to address those questions here on today's webinar. I just wanted to make mention of an upcoming workshop in Health for a Change we'll be holding in Paducah, Kentucky. That's a live workshop. Join us at the McCracken Public Library, and it'll be on December 5th, Wednesday, working with the media. There are spots open for that in-person workshop in Paducah. Thanks to the library there for hosting us. Also, I'm working to plan for 2019. Please, I welcome your ideas and topics of what you'd like in terms of training for 2019 on Health for a Change. Next up, I wanted to thank the Coalition for a Smoke-Free Tomorrow. The Coalition for a Smoke-Free Tomorrow is a coalition of health advocates working on smoke-free communities in Kentucky, and they suggested this topic for us on prevention. So thank you to them, and you can check out information on their website at smokefreetomorrow.org. Next, I want to turn the call over to Tanya Chang, who will be talking about some of her work. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tanya Chang. I'm the Regional Vice President of Field Advocacy for the American Heart Association. I cover Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. And I took this job in August. Prior to that, I was the Heart Association's Government Relations Director for Kentucky for almost 14 years. And I'm going to talk to you today about Senate Bill 93 that we had during the 2018 legislative session, which was our effort to repeal and restore local control that would have given communities the ability to pass local laws like Tobacco 21 and things like that. Unfortunately, Kentucky is one of a number of states that is preempted. This legislation was something that the tobacco industry used as a nationwide strategy in the 90s, and it stuck in Kentucky. This bill, I believe, passed in the mid-1990s, and it prohibits communities from doing anything at the local level to restrict or regulate the sale, display, or purchase of tobacco products. And we know, by and large, where the biggest place that Tobacco 21 is making progress across the country really is at the local level. There's hundreds of communities across the country that has passed Tobacco 21 laws, and unfortunately, as long as this statute is on the books, Kentucky is not able to do that. And so the Heart Association was one of the lead agencies in support of Senate Bill 93, but we weren't the only one. It was supported by a number of organizations, including the Kentucky League of Cities, the Lung Association, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky, Greater Louisville Incorporated, the Kentucky Association of Local Health Departments, the Kentucky chapter of the American College of Cardiology, the Medical Association, the School Boards Association, the Kentucky Smokefree Tomorrow Coalition, Kentucky Voices for Health, and Kentucky Youth Advocates. And despite this level of support from all these organizations, Senate Bill 93 did not as much as get a committee hearing, not even an informational hearing. When it was introduced, it was assigned to the Senate State and Local Government Committee, and that committee Chairman Joe Bowen, who is retiring from the Senate, he would not hear the bill. The sponsors of the bill were Senator Julie Rocky Adams, who was chairwoman of the Senate Health and Welfare Committee at the time, along with Senators Alice Forgy Kerr and Dr. Alvarado. And the reason it could not get a committee hearing, we believe, is because of the opposition. And the opposition on this particular issue doesn't just come from the tobacco industry, but it also comes from the Retail Federation, which represents, the convenience stores and retail outlets that sell tobacco products. It's our understanding that Senator Adams is interested in reintroducing the legislation in 2019, and so I would encourage all of us when that happens to jump on board and support that legislation. And with that, I'll move on to the next person.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ellen Hahn, and I'm a professor and director of the Kentucky Center for Smoke-Free Policy, which is located in the College of Nursing at UK. So welcome from the Wildcat country here. So just one thing I want to say, first of all, I guess they asked me to do this because I've been in Kentucky since 1993 doing tobacco control. So I'm going to give you a little thumbnail sketch of preemption since I've been in the state. So, and I want to start out actually just with a definition of preemption, and you can see that on the left, but essentially it's removing communities' rights to enact a local public health law. We're talking about preemption related to tobacco primarily, but I think as Mark's going to mention, it extends to really any public health law. And you can see on the right that in the tobacco documents, you can see why the tobacco industry really likes preemption, because they can shift the battle away from the community level back to the state where they're on stronger ground. They have more influence at the state house than at the courthouse. So a little bit of legalese here. I'm not a lawyer. Many of you know that Kentucky Center for Smoke-Free Policy has legal resources that we use. And what I thought was important to tell you about is that there is a doctrine in Kentucky that affects both counties and cities. And essentially when states pass a law, the counties and cities cannot enact any conflicting ordinance. It has to be consistent with state law. And really when Congress enacts legislation at the federal level, states may not pass conflicting state laws. So really it kind of is similar at every level of government. And in Kentucky, we have a KRS, a Kentucky regulatory statute, that talks about the counties, and that they, according to, otherwise, provided by KRS or the Kentucky Constitution, fiscal courts really have very broad delegation of power in Kentucky that permits them to exercise their right, their power, their privileges, as long as it's not in conflict with the Constitution or any statutes. Similarly, Kentucky has home rule for municipalities, and so our home rule KRS, which the number is on the slide, for municipalities says similarly that a city may exercise any power and perform any function within its boundaries, as long as it's not in conflict with the Constitution or any statute. So Tanya mentioned the KRS 438-305, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about it. So this is a case where we have what's called explicit or obvious preemption. And so this was in 1994, right after I actually moved here, so you can blame me, that the General Assembly did enact this piece of legislation that for the purpose of equitable, this was their reason, for the purpose of equitable and uniform enforcement, the provisions shall supersede any subsequently enacted law, ordinance, or regulation that relates to the use, the display, sale, or distribution of tobacco products. And that was originally enacted in '94 with the express intent to occupy the field. And then more recently, they amended it to include the sale of alternative nicotine products or vapor products to persons under 18. So this next slide, though, then talks about the good news, and that is that local smoke-free ordinances in Kentucky are not preempted. And so many of you may remember that in 2003, the Lexington Food and Beverage Association sued the Urban County government, and in that case, it went the whole way to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that this particular piece of law, the KRS 438-305, etc., deals almost exclusively with prohibiting the sale, distribution, and use of tobacco products, and it does not preempt the use of a local ordinance to prohibit the use of tobacco products in public places by anyone. So actually, we have Supreme Court ruling that says that smoke-free ordinances are not preempted, and local governments, cities and counties, can certainly enact smoke-free ordinances. So that's a piece of good news. The last bullet on this slide, though, is something that we get asked about a lot at KCSP, and that is if the city ordinance is stricter than the county or fiscal court ordinances, as long as it's more stringent, it can stand, right? So if a fiscal court has a weak ordinance but a city passes a stronger one, that's okay. It can be more stringent, just not less stringent. So I guess I just wanted to flip back to why this is all happening, and it really comes back to the tobacco industry and other opposition and their front groups. But basically, the reason preemption occurs at the state level is because they know, the industry knows that their record of defeating state restrictions has been really pretty good. So any restriction on smoking, they're able to defeat it at the state level, but with respect to local measures, they've not been as successful. And so that's really why they want preemption, so that local government's hands are tied. There was a move, though, in 2004, so right after Lexington's law was upheld by the Supreme Court, there was kind of a move at the state legislature to pass a bill that would prohibit the use of master settlement agreement money if a locale did pass a local smoke-free ordinance, and that's what's called implicit preemption, or less obvious or indirect or hidden preemption. So while our preemptive law that restricts the manufacture, display, use, and sale at the local level is explicit preemption, we also have this thing called implicit preemption. And so, you know, it was really pretty underhanded. The good news is the bill died through the help of many tobacco control advocates that did a really good job. So I just want to put a shout out to Tanya and others who are lobbyists for us in Frankfort, because they have to keep their eyes and ears open for things like this that could just kind of sneak in, be in the back door, or be amended on a bill. And so it's really an important strategy. I just want to, I think just a couple more slides here, just to put in a plug for that what you can do is focus on local 100% smoke-free ordinances, and we've been pretty successful. We're at about 35% of our state is covered by the good, strong, comprehensive laws that are in blue there. Many cities, but some counties have these laws. 33 are comprehensive out of a total of 50 smoke-free laws. So congratulations to everybody on the phone that's worked so hard to get those laws passed, and we need to be doing that all the time as best you can. You probably hear that other cities and towns around the country are passing flavor bans or flavor restrictions. However, that's preempted in Kentucky, as well as age of sale, like the tobacco 21. And the reason I put likely preempted, we could get into the nuances, but we can talk about this later through questions if you like. There's not been case law on this, whether age of sale is really was intended in the 1994 KRS to restrict the manufacture, use, and sale. So that's all I have, and my contact information is there. If you don't know about us, if you would like to get our partner newsletter, send an email to the address on your screen, and certainly contact us, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and I will turn it over to somebody. I think Tracy.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hahn. And as Dr. Hahn said, my name's Tracy Kennedy. I serve as the Midwest consultant for the national organization, Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights. We also have a sister organization, Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights Foundation. So we are able to do both advocacy and lobbying. And I just wanted to thank the other speakers. I'm in really great company today. And you all, it's great to hear from such experts in the field. Certainly Ellen and Tanya's work in Kentucky has received national attention. And then Mr. Perchek, who's going to speak after me, also served in a role in setting us on a very successful course at Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights. So if you want to hear from the experts on preemption, you're hearing from them today. So it's a good way to spend your lunch hour. If you haven't heard of our organization, we have some great resources available. ProtectLocalControl.org, the website you're seeing on this slide, is all focused on preemption. And then our other website, no-smoke.org, also has some great resources. So part of what we do is to monitor and track policy changes that we compile into a database. We've been working on this issue of smoke-free air for more than 40 years. So we develop model policy language and provide technical assistance. So in my role as Midwest consultant, I work in 13 states, including Kentucky. So several folks have talked really specifically about the different types of preemption. So I won't review that with you all, but they are in these slides. And something I just want to share with you is that while I'm serving as a technical assistance provider now, I worked in local coalitions and for our statewide coalition, and I can appreciate that preemption seems a little daunting to explain. The word is kind of confusing. I think people don't really understand what it means or why it's important. And so those of us speaking today, we live and breathe policy change. I have a master's degree in reviewing public policy. So to us, it's nothing to talk about it. It's our bread and butter. But when you're sitting at your local coalition table, I hope that you'll either contact us or think about ways to make this real for people. I think many of us work in preemption, and we always say that scare tactics don't work. But I will tell you that preemption is the one thing I fear the most. So while I know scare tactics don't work, I'm not trying to scare you all. The preemptive efforts set forth by the tobacco industry and now being picked up by other industries are the thing that keeps me up at night, because I see the blood, sweat, and tears that goes into local change. I see the power of local momentum and to look at the progress, the tremendous progress we've made in incredibly difficult states like Kentucky, and to think in one legislative session, in the last week, in the last day, in the last moments of a session, that could all be erased is a really big challenge that we face each year. And so, I applaud you all for making this issue a priority. And, kind of my word of caution is that our work is never done. Once we pass a policy, we must stay organized and we must stay vigilant and we must continue to recruit policy champions and spokespersons to protect the work that we've done. So since some of my slides were covered, you all got to hear that soapbox moment. So again, like others have said, we want to continue to invest and allow for the power of local control to respond to community needs. So sometimes what we'll hear is, especially from the business community or from larger industries, saying that local control or local governance leads to a patchwork of laws that are confusing for people, confusing for businesses who have to operate in multiple locations. So, we are saying that at the local level, that's where you have the ability to actually customize and make it more relevant. For those of you who maybe live in a rural area, you know that when laws in the state capital are made with Louisville in mind, that it feels really foreign and strange and hard to implement in Paducah. So having local control allows you to have that connection to your local community, and that this patchwork excuse of it being confusing to implement is just a cop-out for industries to negotiate at the statewide level because they know they have less power at the local level and it's more difficult for them to have a paid influence at the local level. And again, easier for compliance to understand. So when you go to enforce the law, compliance is always the goal. As we know, smoke-free laws in particular are very popular, largely self-enforcing, and we don't have a lot of complaints issued. But this allows us to be more responsive to if issues do arrive. So in case you're wondering, why are we yammering on about preemption? Is it really still an issue? Most certainly it is. At our organization, A&R, we're really concerned about the increasing gaps in smoke-free air and public health protections. So those who have been protected in their workplace or in their home for more than a decade are looking at other policy changes like Tobacco 21 or flavorings ordinances or outdoor protections. And then there are still hundreds of thousands of people living in these states where they're preempted from doing anything at the local level. We've also, though, seen some of the most dramatic and exciting efforts to thwart preemption in some of your neighboring states. I would say in West Virginia, they've probably been the most successful in thwarting perennial attacks to local control. So this is what the preemption map looks like. And I just wanted to talk a little bit for 1 minute about how it happens and what makes it so difficult. And so what makes this difficult, we track bills. We have legislative tracking devices that kind of search bills that are introduced, but we really rely on you all because often preemption language is snuck in the 11th hour and some very kind of gray political maneuver that makes it very hard for the public to respond. So in 1 year in West Virginia, there was smoke-free preemption language snuck onto a fireworks bill that was going to have taxation on fireworks. So we just never know where this might come up, or it might come up in an odd committee. So that's why we do really rely on our state lobbying partners, and why we do recommend letting your local coalitions know why, even if you've had a successful smoke-free law for 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, why it's important to have an established relationship with your local representation so that they know you are the go-to resource for tobacco control. So we've also seen interesting things for emerging products. So when e-cigarettes kind of first hit the market, we saw the industry really sweep into state houses to try to pass bills that would create separate product category definitions for electronic cigarettes. So it would be a separate definition outside of the state's even weak smoke-free law, and so then it made it sometimes difficult and confusing for local advocates to understand whether or not they could regulate e-cigarettes because they're in this separate section of code. So we really do have to keep a close eye and monitoring on this because the industry is always ready to come up with a new and innovative way to come up to create preemption. And we say that preemption is always a deal breaker in our model policy language. We always have an explicit non-preemptive language clause because we just find that there are some aspects we may be willing to reach a compromise, but preemption is never one of them. Overcoming preemption is incredibly difficult. Again, just the different tactics that we've seen on smoke-free preemption, exempt and preempt. So if there's a movement to strengthen the statewide smoke-free law, but they want to exempt private membership clubs, they might also say that at the local level, you're not able to include private membership clubs. Again, that's kind of simple to venue-specific preemption for something like a cigar bar or, 21 and older. That's an industry tactic to kind of pick on those few specific things. And I think Mark is going to talk a little bit more about this, but just to kind of tee that up is that, again, the scare tactics, but what we have seen is just this vast growth of preemptive efforts expanding from, other industries saying, oh, that seemed like it worked really well for the tobacco industry. And now we're seeing local efforts on a myriad of issues, so let's work on preempting all of them. So we've seen massive super preemption bills in states like Texas where they preempt local governments from enacting anything more stringent than the local level. Of course, that didn't become law, but the fact that it was introduced really puts us on alert. So we've been working to organize and to stay connected with these other public health issues. And at the community level, I think this is also really important to consider that, as you come together as community partners to try to address community needs, that we should have the ability to do that without facing a preemptive strike from the national level. So we see this from other corporate interests, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, pushing sample preemption bills at their national conferences. So that's why, while it's been a while since we've actually had a preemption statewide bill pass on smoke-free, we're seeing this renewed interest as we see increasing political divide. This is just another way to kind of keep control over local efforts to address public health issues. So again, I invite you to visit our resources, Protect Local Control, no-smoke.org. We do provide technical assistance. We're always willing to review your ordinance language or to work with you all. And I hope that, my one kind of challenge to you all is that you find a way to incorporate a preemption discussion either in your next coalition meeting or in your next newsletter to help kind of others to understand why this issue is important and why it matters to protect local control. So my contact information is in the slides, and I do invite you to contact me if I can help you. So with that, I will pass it on to our last speaker.
Hi, this is Mark Perchuk. I hope everybody can hear me. And I wanted to start by saying thank you for including me. This has been a wonderful set of presentations, and I look forward to questions and discussion. And before I start, I wanted to say that in the work that I do, we take a broad perspective, a national perspective on preemption as part of our mission to support grassroots public health movements. And we also take an historical perspective. And in the case of tobacco control, especially smoke-free policy, and Kentucky in particular, out of all of the issues that Tracy has talked about, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward, tobacco control has been a kind of a miracle of not just stopping preemption, but of actually repealing it, which started in 2002 in Delaware. And the work that Tanya and others on this presentation have done is a kind of an amazing example among the amazing example of the success in tracking, discouraging, and stopping preemption. So I really want to shout out to those of you who are participating and my co-presenters for doing a phenomenal job. And I am very hopeful that you'll be able to continue to do that. And if at the end of this, and as we get into questions, if there are questions about what's going on nationally, about issues like soda tax preemption, which has been particularly hot in the western United States where we're located, where our office is located, or about other issues, I'm very happy to talk about that. For the first time, I think in history of preemption in public health in the United States, the movement to repeal preemption in health and safety issues is building outside of tobacco and on the success of the Smokefree repeal and countering efforts that have gone on over the last 30 years. And I'm very happy to talk about things that have happened in Florida and Virginia and elsewhere if there's an interest in that. I'm the director of Grassroots Change, and most of our work at this point has been focused on our Preemption Watch project, and that's what I'll be talking about today. Our work our work started with support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in 2009, and with research, including research. We did key informant interviews with a very diverse group of leaders and grassroots activists working across issues, including, of course, tobacco control, and including some folks in Kentucky. And that research, which was really done very rigorously in partnership with Johns Hopkins University and Tufts University, we wanted to learn. We wanted to explore whether our own experience, Tracy's experience, the experience of the American Heart Association, and I expect many of you on this webinar, was consistent across issues and nationally. And to do that, we sought out individuals and did confidential interviews with folks ranging from really grassroots community organizers to the leaders of large public health systems, including, as it turned out, some folks in Kentucky. And the issues that those folks had worked on included these issues: obesity prevention, food safety, firearms violence prevention, and the other issues, as well as tobacco. And what we discovered, which was not a huge surprise, was that the experience with preemption and the impact of mostly state preemption. There's federal preemption too, and that's a growing concern, but we're talking here primarily about state preemption in tobacco control and other public health issues, that the strategies and impact of preemption is not just similar across these issues, but essentially identical. And that includes issues that are not as well explored, but issues such as the state preemption of local authority to require residential fire sprinklers has been a tactic of an industry, as well as the better known issues like firearms, where most states, 43 states, preempt all or virtually all authority over firearms and ammunition. And what we learned was that the negative impact of state preemption is universal across these issues, and that the strategies that industry uses are all essentially identical to what the tobacco industry started doing in earnest in 1985 and 1986 when they passed the first preemptive smoke-free preemption law in Florida, which has not, in fact, been repealed yet. So based on that, what we have done is gathered from our own experience and the experience of colleagues like the ANR and the Heart Association and many others, and a growing body of research on the nature of preemption and best practices for tracking, monitoring, and countering, we developed a model that applies to not only to stopping preemption, but also to discouraging the introduction of it. And essentially, these are the same 4 key strategies or tactic areas that work in a repeal campaign as well. So as you can see, the preemption threat, as Tracy and I think everyone who is presenting today would agree, it is a pervasive threat, and it doesn't go away, whether it's tobacco control or whether it's food and nutrition or some other issues such as some farming-related issues. That it's a even when the legislature is out, even when the legislature is out for a year, as it is in Texas as in 2018, that the threat is constant, and it needs to be treated as a constant threat. But the good news is that there are ways of countering that, knowing what's going on, gaining human intelligence from the legislators and legislative staff and grassroots activists, and turning that into the kind of success that, with the exception of the youth access and vaping problem in Kentucky, if you can call it that, Kentucky has exemplified this model. I think that I really think that is the efforts of folks on this call that take most of the credit for the successes in Kentucky across issues. Grassroots Change tracks a number of issues, but 8 specific issues that we track state preemption nationally. And if you look at that map, it's at preemptionwatch.org, you see that Kentucky stands out, at least certainly regionally, but it stands out as a success story. And it's good to remember that while we also have to redouble our efforts to repeal and stop preemption across various issues. And before moving on to the specific strategies, the nice thing about this model, yes, it takes a lot of work. It's exhausting. The folks in West Virginia are a good example. They've worked incredibly hard, heart, cancer, and others, with support from groups like Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights, to stop repeated broad efforts, diverse efforts, sneaky efforts in all kinds of legislation and amendments to preempt local authority over smoke-free. And the same components that go into that movement or that campaign or that process ultimately can stop the introduction or consideration of preemptive amendments or preemptive bills, and as well form the basis for a grassroots movement to repeal preemption in tobacco control or in other public health issues. So the 4 components, as you can see, are monitoring, anticipating, engaging grassroots, unifying allies, and media advocacy. And I think these will be obvious to some of the folks on this call because many of us and you are doing this already. And I'm going to explore briefly each of these with the hope that we can have a discussion about them based on what's of most interest to folks here. So we've touched on this before, but I want to expand and reinforce what's been said. It's consistent with everything that has come before in this webinar in terms of the experience of folks in Kentucky and elsewhere. But the greatest threats still take the form of a plain old preemption clause, express preemption, a clause as the one that's been discussed earlier that specifically says such and such, in this case distribution, sale of tobacco products and now e-cigarettes or related products. That is still probably the most common form of preemption, and amendments as well. It could be a freestanding bill or an amendment. What has changed and what's really worth creating more work, of course, but what's worth paying attention to are some very new, relatively new strategies that are getting a lot of attention and support from folks like ALEC, as Tracy had discussed. One is using fiscal mechanisms. That is to say, the legislature does not pass what is technically or legally preemption, but a legislation that takes money away from cities, or counties, or other subdivisions of the state if they pass a certain kind of local ordinance or a certain kind of fire safety code, for example. Or in the case of Arizona, pretty much anything that a city or county can do at this point places that city or county at risk of losing a large chunk of its local funds that are collected in taxes and redistributed by statute to cities and counties. And what that mechanism does is it creates what we call de facto preemption, because it does essentially the same thing as a ordinary preemption clause or a preemption amendment. But it just makes it almost impossible to take action because of at least the fear that you won't have essential funds, not just for public health. These are funds for police and for the fire service. There are, in addition to that, there are attempts to take away or limit local taxation authority across the board. Today, most of those are aimed at preventing the soda tax movement from growing any farther. And that's, as Tracy said, was the case with the tobacco industry, with the soda industry. That is their number one priority, state preemption of local authority. And they can do that in several ways. A preemption clause that just comes out and says you can't pass any kind of local soda tax, or broadly limits taxation authority across the board. And the next item, which is in the case of states like Colorado, where you have authority to place initiatives or ballot measures on the local ballot, to limits on direct democracy, it limits on all local ballot measures in order to stop, typically to stop perhaps tobacco control and soda taxes and other nutrition initiatives is the real focus of that at this point. Blanket preemption, again, Arizona has a form of blanket preemption. I would define as state preemption that covers 3 or 4 or 5 discrete issues or more, as in the case of Arizona. It's been introduced in Texas in 2015 and 2017. I assume it will be introduced again in 2019 when the Texas legislature comes back. And again, the savings clause, and this was discussed earlier, Ellen discussed this earlier, savings clause is critical, and the language that Ellen shared is good language, and it's typical, and it's essential, as I think all of us have discussed. Those are the types of preemptions to be aware of, but the process is both simple but also includes a couple different components, and one of which is very important, which I'll discuss. One is this: never wait to hear from someone that a bill or an amendment has been introduced. That's almost always too late. Assume it is, and put in place, for example, human intelligence networks of insiders and outsiders who can share between the grassroots and those inside the legislature as staff members or legislators themselves, and have those in place all the time, so that there is a system for if there's a rumor, if there is a plan, that information gets out very, very quickly. Other forms, this has been said before, but it can't be reinforced too much. Preemption is almost always adopted at the end of a legislature or in the process at the last minute that it legally can be done. So that is something which should be expected. There's always been something of a tradition on a part of groups like ALEC and the tobacco industry and now the soda industry, of using the state budget to include a rider or amendment that preempts an issue that's not related to the budget necessarily. It doesn't really matter. That can be done in some states under the state constitution, and it's something to watch out for, because it's becoming like all of the issues that are at risk, all of the public health and safety movements that are at risk today, as Tracy presented. All of these strategies are becoming more common and should be expected. In some cases, 3 or 4 of these will be tried in a single legislature on a single issue in order for the industry to succeed and find a channel that they can move this at least to the floor of the legislature. again, very important that as it's important to have lawyers involved, obviously those who are familiar with a given state constitution and statutes and cases, but that it's very rare, if not non-existent, for lawyers to come in after the passage of preemption and express preemption at any rate, rather than the implied preemption that was discussed, and fix the situation in court. Because the state has typically the state has the authority to preempt, mainly because all of the authority to create subdivisions of the state at one point came from the state, just as the federal government has the authority to preempt stronger or weaker state laws. And finally, repeal, although it's becoming possible and it's certainly on the agenda, outside of tobacco control and specifically smoke-free laws, repealing preemption is, if not impossible, incredibly difficult and should be avoided as a strategy because it's probably going to be a lot more expensive and a lot harder than stopping preemption at some stage of the game. Unifying allies is the next piece of the pie, and it may seem simple, but it's also possibly the most important, because where you see failures to stop, monitor, and combat preemption, it often has to do with a failure to unify the key coalition, state, grassroots, local coalition that is promoting public health, unifying really specifically on preemption, as Tracy said, from our perspective and from A&R's perspective and from the Heart Association's perspective. It's really never an acceptable compromise, and it shouldn't be. And a key aspect of that is making sure that there's a way to hold each other accountable, to make it clear that if one or two groups or parts of a coalition decide to negotiate preemption, that there's a mechanism for at least sharing that information so that others can participate in standing firm and stopping preemption. Grassroots engagement, of course, is very important. And I'm not going to say too much about this because there's a lot of resources already in the state and nationally regarding this, and a lot of capacity at the state and local level as well. And but what I would say is that there's an important role for not just grassroots activists and having those networks in place, but grassroots leadership that builds trust with the grassroots advocates, with the local groups, with local governments, and a lot of communication that's internal to that movement. And as a note, as a general rule, my own experience has been that the strongest of movements, public health movements, including public health movements to stop or repeal preemption, have a combination of paid personnel and volunteers. And that's there are various reasons for that, but that has mainly been my personal experience in various campaigns. And finally, media advocacy. This can be one of the most effective and sometimes one of the easiest, or I should say less expensive and in some ways less time-consuming strategies, using educating and using free media. It doesn't have to be a lot, but influential media in the state, some national media, local media, and educating the media before there's a specific threat of preemption or before the campaign officially starts to repeal preemption on a given issue. And I think I've seen, if I could point to a failure that I've seen, not a failure is the wrong term, it's judgmental, I don't mean it that way, but if I've seen campaigns that have not succeeded in stopping preemption in public health, I think the most common thing that seems to be missing is maximizing the attention that the media is paying through media advocacy and earned media. And I put the ALEC graphic up there because one of the best ways to interest the media, one of the most important messages to get out, is that these campaigns are invariably managed and coming from outside the state and from specific industries, or in the case of ALEC, many industries that are simply not trying to provide uniform protections, but to eliminate all health and safety regulation at the community, state, and for that matter at the federal level. That is what I'd like to share. I hope I haven't taken too long, and I'd like to make sure I leave enough time for questions for everyone. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mark. This is Rochelle again. Thank you for everyone on the call, and thanks for chatting in your questions. I do have a question for our speakers. And Mark, you were kind of talking about this in your advocacy work. I'll pull up your slide here with the schematic. And I believe each of our speakers has worked with youth in the past. So if you would speak briefly on how we can involve youth on addressing preemption, and if you can give specific examples and be brief, because I know all of you have different examples. Mark, if you want to go ahead and start with your experience working with youth in preemption.
Well, I think I'm most interested in hearing from the others, but what I would say, my main thought about that is that those of us who have worked with grassroots movements that are diverse, including diverse in age, I think have learned that youth activists can be incredibly sophisticated and effective. And I've seen that on many issues. And in the case of preemption, I have seen broad grassroots movements, grassroots networks that have included a lot of young people, many of whom may be involved in a public health program, but that program is very focused on policy, and including that policy often does include stopping or repealing preemption. So I would just say never underestimate anyone, but never underestimate young people especially.
Ellen,
So,
do you want to share your experiences on working with youth or your advice?
Yeah, this is Ellen. Yeah, I would echo Mark's sentiments. There are quite a few active youth advocacy trainings and groups in the state. And my experience way long ago, like in the mid-'90s when we got preemption, we did try to engage youth at that time to talk about it. The only barrier is it's a tough concept, so messaging with kids with youth is important. I mean, they can get it. I mean, I agree with Mark. Don't underestimate youth. It's just that, and maybe it's like, hey, let us be responsible for our own, health here at home. Don't tie our hands. We had to come up with some ways to frame it. But that's true with adults as well. That's my only 2 cents.
Tanya or Tracy, did you want to add in any additional comments on youth working with youth?
Yeah, I'll just offer that you may have read in my bio that I got my start in tobacco control as a youth advocate as a high school student in tobacco control programs. So again, if I can reiterate, don't underestimate your impact on developing those youth, because it's launched my career, and that's the only issue I've ever worked on. But to Ellen's perspective, I think youth can actually be really creative. So, use it as a teachable moment to help them understand what preemption could mean for them, and see what they come up with, see what tactics they come up with. But it's a great idea to have them talk about why local activity at the local level matters to them and why they want to impact their community. And I think they're a great voice and advocate. I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that we have to make the case to state legislators that there's a there. So when the Cancer Society or the Heart Association goes to a state legislator and says, local people want to keep their communities smoke-free, local people want smoke-free air, it's kind of awkward and embarrassing if they've never heard from a local person that same message. So we just have to make sure that we amplify our voices about the importance of smoke-free communities, addressing e-cigarette use, and utilizing youth to make that message real is really helpful to statewide efforts.
Thanks, Tracy. And there are a couple specific questions coming through about next steps in Kentucky. What's going to happen in the legislative session? What's the next step on preemption in Kentucky? for the speakers working in Kentucky, do you have a 30 seconds advice on what a person should do if they want to get involved or learn more about the next steps in Kentucky?
Sure, this is Tanya. I don't mind taking that one. So we just got the recent commitment from Senator Adams to refile the anti-preemption bill for retail sales. And so we're going to rebuild that campaign from the ground up, and there's lots of room to join us in that effort. I would encourage you guys to contact our new Government Relations Director who covers Kentucky, and that is Shannon Smith. And her email address is simply Shannon, SHANNON, .smith@hart.org. If you would like to get in and join us on that campaign. One thing I'd like to add that hasn't really been covered is I think our strongest ally on either getting rid of preemption or defending against preemption, at least in Kentucky so far, has really been the Kentucky League of Cities, because they represent the voice of elected officials and communities who don't want their rights taken away. And we partnered with them back in the day when smoke-free preemption was at risk, and then we've more recently partnered with them on our effort to repeal the retail preemption bill. And they are a terrific ally, with voices across Kentucky to join us. But in terms of, legitimate next steps, it's too late. I don't think that Senator Adams will pre-file her bill. It's not really necessary at this time, but I guess early in the legislative session, watch for an iteration of Senate Bill 93 to get refiled. It will likely go back to the State and Local Government Committee. This year there is a new chairman since Senator Bowman retired. It's Senator Will Schroeder from Northern Kentucky. If any of you all on this call are from Northern Kentucky, I would encourage you to reach out to him and see where he is on that. We have not met with him yet because, as I said, Senator Adams just recently expressed an interest to refile that bill, and Senator Schroeder was just recently appointed to be chairman of that committee, but we do look for it to start in the Senate, and we'll be looking to reaffirm that all the organizations that I mentioned at the beginning of the call are still with us, and then we'll be seeking endorsements and trying to really grow more of a coalition-led effort around that to really put pressure on them to move that legislation, because, as I said, when we filed it last time, it really just sat dormant in a committee, and there wasn't any consequences from that. It is sort of hard to get to message around and getting, real volunteer interest in that. So if you all, want to join that coalition effort, we're really going to be looking for folks to be communicating support for this to their lawmakers.
Thanks, Tanya, for your reply. Finally, I want to thank our speakers for joining us today. I learned a lot. Thank you for your time and all your efforts for preparing this webinar. Again, to our participants, the recording of the webinar and the full slide deck with all of our presenters' contact information will be available very soon. Also, thanks to Coalition for a Smoke-Free Tomorrow for suggesting this topic and idea. I will ask all the participants, please take a moment. I'll send an email this afternoon to you with the post-event survey. I would love to hear your feedback on this webinar today. Give me your suggestions for future topics. The average time is only 3 minutes, so I would certainly appreciate your time in sending your feedback to me. Again, I'm honored to work at the Foundation for a Healthy Kentucky. I welcome your ideas and suggestions for 2019 on data and this training series. I hope all of you have a great afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today on this Health for a Change training.